Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Understanding the Interaction Between Climate Change, Housing, and Public Health, brought to you by the Network for Public Health Law. I'm Maddie Kim, the Public Health Associate at the Network's National Office and Northern Region Office, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Just a quick note that both the presentation slides and video playback for this webinar will be available on the Network's website shortly after the conclusion of today's event. We strongly encourage attendee participation, so feel free to submit any questions at any time during this webinar by using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Today, the moderator for this webinar is Betsy Lawton. Betsy is the Deputy Director of the Northern Region Office here at the Network for Public Health Law. So Betsy will be leading us through the rest of today's webinar. So Betsy, over to you.
Thanks, Maddie. Good afternoon, everyone. We are so pleased that you can join us for this webinar on understanding the intersection between climate change, housing, and public health. I'm just going to briefly introduce the speakers before they get started with their presentations. First, we will hear from Melissajones. She's the Executive Director of the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative. Her work focuses on the intersection of social determinants of health, social inequity, and well-being. And her experience includes work in municipal government and nonprofits in the Bay Area's large and small cities. Before joining BioHigh, Melissa served as the Senior Program Officer at Boston Local Initiative Support Corporation, where she launched and ran its Resilient Communities, Resilient Families initiative. Melissa has additional experience funding and implementing programs focused on community economic development, family financial stability, education, and civic empowerment. Following her presentation, we will hear from Maria Lopez Nunez, who is the Deputy Director of Environmental Justice and Advocacy for the Ironbound Community Corporation. She's an environmental justice organizer and plays a large role in activating and uplifting her community, while also pushing for policies to address environmental injustice locally, regionally, and nationally. She's on the board of the Climate Justice Alliance and serves on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. She also helped pass the country's strongest cumulative impacts law in the state of New Jersey last year and helped Newark become the third city in the country with the right to counsel, as well as the landmark People's Bill to protect community members from eviction during the pandemic. And then we will hear from Brianne Schell. She is a staff attorney with the network's Eastern region. In addition to the affordable housing work that she'll be presenting on today, she has worked in a variety of topic areas during her time with the network, including maternal health, tobacco and marijuana regulation, and public health authority. Before joining the network, I've moved on to Brianne. Before joining the network, Brianne earned her JD and master's degree in public policy from the Ohio State University, during which time she worked with organizations such as Ohio Legal Aid and the Ohio General Assembly, and also the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Brianne's current and upcoming work with the network centers around health equity and how natural and built environments impact human health. So we have a great lineup of speakers today, and we look forward to hearing from you all. And so with that, I will hand it over to you, Melissa.
Great, thank you. And I am going to share a PowerPoint. Give me just one minute to set it up here. Okay, good morning, everyone from the West Coast. I'm Melissajones with BioHigh. We're the coalition of the Bay Area's governmental public health departments. We were founded specifically to work on the 80% of things that matter to our health that happen outside the doctor's office. And so we focus on issues such as housing affordability, economic opportunity, and racial justice. We know that these have a huge impact on what we see in terms of disparities in disease rates and in life expectancy. And they are priorities that have been adopted by the World Health Organization around how we move to a healthier society. And so my goal today is to take us from a vicious cycle of housing affordability and climate change and health issues through to a conversation that's about what a more virtuous cycle could look like, and a set of solutions we think are very pragmatic and practical that we're moving through now. So I want to start just by talking about the intersections between housing affordability, climate, and our long-term health. And this is a cycle that I think people often think of in segments or issue areas, but actually we find impact certain communities and families in very deep ways, in overlapping ways. And so what we see in places as expensive as the San Francisco Bay Area is that we have high housing costs that strain family budgets. We then see that strain in family budget shows up with families having these impossible choices that they make. In particular, we undertook a report with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco to understand just what families are doing when their housing cost burdens are so high. And what we found out is families are having to choose to squeeze the parts of their budget that are most flexible. And those are the parts of your budget that don't have you ending up homeless, which means your rent isn't flexible, but your food costs are. Your rent isn't flexible, but your medical costs are. So we found that families who are housing cost burdened are spending a third less on food, not in a good way, and 5 times less on medical care, which means they're waiting for an earned income or a tax credit in the tax credit cycle in order to do a whole bunch of medical care that from a health perspective, we would hope people would do throughout the year if they could afford it. And so we see those two things crunching family budgets in very real ways. And then we see families starting to make choices about where to live based on that. And we start to see more and more families moving either into scenarios that show up in what is called the new super commuter, or we see families moving to places that tend to be more climate and environmental justice vulnerable. And so those things start to layer. The income and the climate impacts start to layer there. And then we start to see in places all across the country, but particularly here in the Bay Area, where we have both vulnerability to flood and vulnerability in sea level rise and fires, wildfires, we see that there's a disproportionate impact of those issues for families. And so we see a lot of our less expensive housing sitting in floodplains, right? And already flooding more than they had before. And then we also see a number of families ending up in scenarios where COVID-19, wildfires, or flooding have interrupted work and income. The challenge around that is a lot of the ways that an emergency response is set up makes it really difficult for hourly employees in particular, but for a lot of different kinds of day labor and other employees to get the emergency response dollars that replace that lost income. So we find that people end up back in a cycle that has them behind as they're looking at their housing costs. And this cycle is really, really difficult, as you can imagine, for families. We also think it's not the only way it could show up. It could look really different, right? If we could get housing affordability and our equity in government emergency response working in the right ways, we could really see reduced impact of climate and health disasters on family income and health in ways that would really matter for the long term. On the next slide, I just want to take you through what this combined sense of really high housing costs and vulnerability to disaster has meant for just one community in the Bay Area, and then talk about how it's rippling out across the country. We're located in the San Francisco Bay Area. That's San Francisco, the places that people know are San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, really high cost cities that people are quite familiar with. What we've seen over the last couple of decades is the kind of displacement that it's shocking doesn't make the news more than it does. So what we've seen is that East Palo Alto, a small city right outside of San Jose, has seen a 66% decrease in Black population. Berkeley, San Francisco, and Oakland have seen between 40 and 50% of the Black population gone. It's a really big number. And the movement we're seeing, we see people moving to Brentwood, Antioch, Elk Grove, Stockton, all communities that we would call super commuter communities with over an hour, with large proportions of the community commuting for over an hour, right? Which has its own impact on the climate cycle, and is a reason why so many affordable housing advocates and environmental justice advocates are working together on issues of affordability. The issue of the Bay Area is not unique. And so actually we see, just looking again at just one community, Black communities across California, we see that the trend in the Bay Area is the same trend for the Los Angeles area. Massive movements inland to communities much farther from the job centers, which much longer commute times, which have impacts not only on greenhouse gases, but on time available for families, et cetera. And we see it actually across the nation. And so the largest growth areas are growth areas you would associate with super commutes. It's Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, Minneapolis, Vegas, Phoenix. And they all have something in common, the affordability quotient for their housing. And so what we've seen about how people are moving, in particular, thinking of the Black community, which we think a lot about at Bar High, because of the massive differences in life expectancy we see across the country for Black communities and in our own localities. And what we find is people are moving on two tracks, seeking two things. They're seeking affordability in rentals and affordability in home ownership, with the idea that that will create for themselves a better living environment, an opportunity to spend more on childcare or child enrichment, an opportunity to feel like there's a way to get ahead of making ends meet. And what we know has helped people stay, this is all research that we're happy to share with folks, is community investment, affordability, affordable rentals, home ownership, and jobs that help people keep pace with the changes in housing cost. Now, we could lament on this, except that we have really good solutions at this point to housing affordability. And I'd like to share a couple of them with you today. And we think there's a moment for us to get really creative right now about housing affordability and racial equity in a way that can benefit climate change and health. And in particular, in this moment where there's once in a generation federal investment for the state of California, where we have the largest surplus we've ever seen, there really is a moment to be investing in affordability through a racial equity lens that could really benefit climate and health. And so the way things look right now is that Black developers are asked to apply for one-off projects and funding pools, that project development doesn't pay enough to do the planning and visioning that would do the full circle planning for climate vulnerabilities that's so important for communities, that there is often a very deep underinvestment in the commercial corridors that could be creating jobs in many communities that have larger communities of Black people. And then that we haven't had, in most places, an anti-displacement strategy for the scale of displacement we've seen in Black communities. Just to give you an example, over the last couple of decades, 300,000 Black people have left Chicago. 175,000 Black people have left coastal California. These are not small numbers. These are massive mobility trends that have an impact for health and climate. And so the Bay Area has come up with a solution that we're working on advocating for pretty hard, called Black Hat, that creates and establishes a $500 million pool that would do the things that we would consider the holy grail of community development, which is to be able to do the community planning that would integrate climate, housing affordability, and racial justice, to do that planning and to know that the money is following right behind it to do the capacity building and hiring that Black-led organizations or other BIPOC-led organizations would need to deliver the plan, and then to do the brick and mortar development that's needed, and to do that all in one fund. We're not raising expectations in community planning, hoping you can identify the resources to do it later, but instead to have a community controlled fund that would do it all. And to supplement that with the federal resources that are coming in through a locality by locality advocacy plan focused on funding projects that have not been funded before. We've taken on this strategy in a way that we think is replicable across the country, which is we've identified Black-led developers, housing folks, regional strategists, economic development folks, who have lived and worked and been and loved the Bay Area for a long time, and are ready to find a solution to the massive displacement that we've seen. I'm sharing here the scale of expertise that's available in that group. There's Bar High, which is a health regional strategist. There's economic development folks, developers, homeless advocates, and home ownership folks. And here I'm sharing the kind of coalition we've been able to put together. I know you're going to hear from a community organizer next. And this strategy around coalition work we think can be so powerful. And so we started with 40 Black-led organizations with personal experience and staff with personal experience on what displacement has meant. We then wrapped around it a series of allies from different kinds of community development and community foundation partnerships, and then wrapped another layer of support around it of local elected officials, including folks people would know, like the mayor of Oakland, and a number of local county board of supervisors, including in places people think of as strong Black communities like Alameda County, where Oakland is, and places that people don't think of as much as Black communities, but where Black communities exist, like Sonoma in the wine country up north. And so we really think this kind of organizing can create a strategy that centers the needs of affordability for those who can tend to be most impacted by climate disasters and housing at the same time. And then create and wrap the coalition around it that creates a solution that can shift us to a much more virtuous cycle than we've seen on housing affordability and climate, where housing costs fit family budgets, where families are able to spend on childcare enrichment, health, and food without the stress of staying up at night, figuring out how to make ends meet, where families live in communities close to friends, extended family, and network, and where our housing suffering from sea level rise or wildfire impacts are mitigated or shifted, those risks, and then where climate impacts and burdens are reduced, therefore, for moderate income and low income families across the region. And really the last piece, a piece that we work on in another part of our work, less housing centered, more government equity centered, is we have a strategy that requires the rapid response and rolling recovery of natural disasters to prioritize equity and response in an automated way. Right now, the process is a response system gets stood up. There are certain considerations that must be made for people with disabilities. And the rest of what equity looks like is really less defined. We have a bill running now in partnership with public health advocates that would propose statewide in California a screen to be used for the awarding of all emergency response dollars that would take and automate equity in the allocation of response. And we have a campaign that we've run and supported over a number of years now, starting with COVID, and then in the year and a half since, of placing equity officers in emergency response, designed to ensure equity and response throughout the process. So I'm going to stop there I'm going to close my remarks here. My name is Melissajones. I'm the executive director. I'm happy to, we have reports on each of these items that I've shared today. I'm happy to share those with you. And then Monet Boyd, our staff planner, is leading a lot of the organizing around the Black housing agenda. So for people who are interested in that, her contact information is there. Happy to answer more questions later as you have them.
Thank you. I guess I just take it from here. So I will not be sharing any slides, right? I'm try to keep it organic during these talks. I'm Maria Lopez Nunez, and I'm with Ironbound Community Corporation. And a lot of folks don't know where Ironbound is or where Newark, New Jersey is, right? But if you're flying to New York City, you've probably flown in or by Newark Airport. The Ironbound is the community that's located, one of the communities located right next to the airport. And our community is really small, I guess, in the scale of big cities, but we're about 66,000 people in our neighborhood. And we're surrounded by the country's longest Superfund site, right? So I like to think of Newark as a pork chop, and the fatty part, that's where the Ironbound is, and the river surrounds us. And when that river is called the Passaic River. And during the Vietnam War, we were actually the largest producers of Agent Orange, right? And from Agent Orange, there's a byproduct called dioxin that was being dumped into the rivers, and that was being carried on trucks all over the neighborhood, to the point that a lot of the public pools had to close down because they were contaminated with dioxin, which is an incredibly cancer-causing agent for human beings. In our neighborhood, there's also the state's largest garbage incinerator, the state's largest sewage treatment facility. We have 3 power plants, and we're right next to the port of Newark of New York and New Jersey, right? Port Newark. And from Port Newark, we get thousands of diesel spewing trucks a day. Our neighborhood is a predominantly Latino neighborhood with a significant Black population. There's very little white folks in the city of Newark, right? The city of Newark is a predominantly Black city. It is about 48% Black and 42% Latinx Hispanic, right? It's just about 6% white. And I think the story of our city is where housing and climate, environmental justice, and public health, they really meet. They're on a crash course with each other. You know, to back up here a little bit, the history of environmental justice is separate from the environmental movement, right? Environmental justice in this country has always been defined by environmental racism, about racist land use practices that put toxic facilities near the homes of Black and brown folks, of toxic facilities being dumped on indigenous reservations throughout the country. So it's something that unites people of color across the country, is the discrimination when it comes to where our homes are and where toxic facilities are. And we're joining that with low income white folks. But in states like New Jersey, an indicator of if you live near toxic pollution is race, even more so than class, right? In New Jersey, if you're income Black or brown, you're still more likely to live next to pollution than if you're low income white. And it shows that racism's just been a marker of who are the people who get sacrificed, who are the people that are disposable. In New Jersey, we're seeing, right, like across the country, in some parts we're seeing wildfires, like the previous speaker described, we're seeing droughts. On the East Coast, what we're seeing is tremendous rainfall, right? In our neighborhood, because of the impervious surfaces, right, that means when water falls down, it cannot get to the earth, right? It's probably been paved over, it's concrete. The water just runs. So after 10 minutes of rain, our neighborhood starts flooding, right? I think it became the most obvious during Superstorm Sandy in 2012. That was, I think, New Jersey's first wake-up call. What you see about Superstorm Sandy is that it's often talked about in terms of the coast, right? Where people had vacation homes. You don't hear about cities like Newark, like Patterson, majority Black and brown cities who were devastated by these impacts. During Sandy, organizations like Ironbound Community Corporation, we had to become first responders and really listen, you know, reach out to our neighbors, set up pantries. We became flooded to the point that the emergency services could not get to us because unfortunately our neighborhood is low lying. And in that low lyingness, right, like our ways in and out of the neighborhood become flooded. We become impassable and become an island unto ourselves. So this is where our folks live and our folks can't afford to move out, right? So a big strategy of ours has been, of course, on one hand, fighting environmental injustice, but also fighting against housing inequality, displacement, especially our city and our neighborhood is 78% renters. That means that most people are in a precarious situation when it comes to living, right? At the whim of a landlord. During Sandy, I think the rest of the state started paying attention. It's something that in our neighborhood we knew for a long time. And where it's also intersecting, it's not just climate change, because one thing I hear a lot is climate change will affect us all. But what we hold in our movement is climate change will affect us all differently, and it will affect us along racial and class lines. And when climate change, when I think about our neighborhood, I think about the toxic water. It's not just water coming into our apartments and homes or basements. It's toxic water coming from that open sewers, right? Like the sewage pits that are in the sewage treatment facility. Those are the river. And during Sandy, a tidal wave brought that in. Our prison is right next and in between all of this industry. So the prison was flooded with toxic waters, and then the inmates were forced to clean up. You know, this is all very gloom and doom, and it feels overwhelming for the folks of the Ironbound and people of Newark. But one thing that's really helped us is policy change, thinking about how as a community we can get control and really not just treat the symptoms of the problem, but try to get to the root cause of these issues. How do we change policy so that it doesn't just affect one or two people, but it affects many thousands of people? A good example of this was during after Ida, our organization came together with other frontline organizations to be able to distribute money directly to people that were impacted. Unfortunately, FEMA took a long time to recognize our community as being by had ripped across the country. And unfortunately, what FEMA was looking for was property damage. So when we're thinking about low income communities, we're not thinking about folks to own their homes. As I said before, our neighborhood is 78% renters. So we weren't even being seen by FEMA. That was a big fight for us. And so we were trying to make sure that people had money to make it through, to get home, to change their clothes, right? So that they can go to work, because unfortunately, the Northeast, so many people live in basements. So as we're thinking about climate change, rising waters, increased sea level rise, it's going to impact a tremendous amount of people who are not protected by most of our housing laws currently. You know, that's why we've been fighting for a strong right to counsel. A big belief we have is that we need to be able to stay in our homes, stay where we've been fighting to move the neighborhood around us. We've been fighting to have more of a barrier between us and the river. I think, as the previous speaker said, when we're displaced from our homes, we're going to go further away to a situation that's probably worse off. So for us, we've been pursuing strategies like rent control to make sure that people can stay in their buildings. We fundamentally believe we can't just build our way out of, to also deal with people's homes today and enforce rent control laws that help people stay, making sure that we're fighting against vacancy decontrol that, you know, accelerates gentrification. Gentrification and climate change are also incredibly linked. We're seeing that in places where homes were completely destroyed, the master plan is now calling for higher rise buildings, right, to avoid that flooding. And in that way, displacing what would be land that could be used for affordable units. So that's another strategy that Ironbound has been pursuing, is thinking about how do we balance the competing needs of trying to fortify ourselves against climate change, but making sure that we can ensure that the land in Newark stays affordable and that the average Newarker can afford to stay here. Because I'll just close with this. Our neighborhoods fight, and they are filled with community activists that know how to stand up for themselves, and not just themselves and their families, but the communities around them. We want to make sure that they benefit from that and that they're not displaced and having to go somewhere off further in, right? Because we're close to the transit line right now, and we're afraid that we'll go somewhere where people will have to drive. Right now in Newark, less than 40% of people own their cars, right? We really rely on public transportation, even though that has its own climate change risk. So we want to make sure that across the country, when we're thinking about cities, when we're thinking about climate change, we don't pursue race neutral policies. So anything that's race neutral is probably racist. So we need to make sure that we're looking really at the racial implications of anything we do, because climate change is going to impact people of color and low income communities across this country first and worst. So I think that's more of a warning call, and I'll pass it off to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to get my screen shared. Let's see. Okay, so I'll assume you can't see my notes unless somebody tells me otherwise, but I'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to talk about some more law and policy approaches to making housing more affordable and available. So I'll get started. Here's a little agenda. So I'll just start out with what is affordable housing, what is that considered? And then I'll talk about 4 different strategies to making housing more affordable and widely available: public housing, mortgage and home ownership assistance, community land trusts, and zoning. So affordable housing, according to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, housing is considered affordable when the occupant dedicates 30% or less of their income to their rent or mortgage payments and their utilities. However, nearly half of renters spend more than 30% of their incomes, and nearly a quarter of them spend more than 50%. This leaves less for renters to spend on other important needs like nutrition and healthcare, just like Melissa mentioned earlier. which can cause them to postpone or skip necessary medical treatment and wait to get treatment until the conditions are exacerbated. So don't worry if you can't see the numbers on here, it's not important. I just wanted to show kind of the trends. So national median rent has been increasing each year. The first graph on the top left shows percent change each month since 2018. The graph on the bottom right shows percent increases in home prices since 2019. We also know that wage growth has not been keeping up. For example, we know that federal minimum wage has stayed at $7.25 since 2009. So these stats suggest that legal and policy intervention is necessary to make housing more affordable and to protect the public health benefits of a balanced budget and safe, stable housing. So I'll start diving into a few of these interventions now. Start with public housing. Public housing is rental housing owned by the government and managed by a local public housing authority and then rented for a below market price. Can be in the form of single family homes, but most often is seen in multifamily dwellings. Residents are charged 30% of their income as rent, or at least $50 a month, or maybe some other flat rate established by the Public Housing Authority. So to be eligible to live in public housing in the United States, you must earn 80% or less of the median area income, but the Department of Housing and Urban Development also requires that at least 40% of public housing residents be at or below 30% of the area median income. Unfortunately, most public housing entities do not have any trouble meeting that threshold. So before I get started on this slide, I do just want to point out that these images may not be actual public housing units. I just chose from some of the first results on a Google Images search just to kind of show you what the different perceptions of public housing are. Public housing in the US has a bad reputation and carries some stigma, in part because the program is so underfunded and conditions can be poor. Also, supply doesn't meet demand, so there could be some crowding. HUD estimates that $21 billion in maintenance and repairs is needed just to keep up with existing public housing. So to be successful, public housing programs need to reduce this stigma, invest more in improving conditions and growing to meet demand, and eventually expand eligibility requirements. So I'll use France as an example of successful public housing. There, 17% of the country's population lives in public housing, compared to less than 1% in the United States. And family income is only one of many considerations for eligibility. They also look at your occupation, your student status, family size, age, disability status, and more. France's program has been successful because of substantial public support, and they also have mandatory employer contributions to the program and have had those in place since 1943. Additionally, instead of concentrating public housing in urban segregated low-income areas, France builds public housing in diverse areas, which encourages racial and ethnic diversity and expands access for the public housing residents to neighborhoods with better funded services like schools and parks. Although, as I just mentioned, US public housing could use some work, it does still benefit the people who live there. So people who move from worse living situations into public housing experience significant mental and physical health improvements, and young adults living in public housing report increased feelings of safety. Also, as I mentioned, we have a public housing shortage in the US, but unfortunately, a federal law is increasing substantial growth. So in 1998, the Faircloth Amendment capped the number of public housing units allowed in the United States at the 1999 number. So while we are not currently at the maximum nationwide, I have an example in Philly, growth is capped by this law. So a total of 7 bills have been introduced in both chambers of Congress this session to repeal that amendment and release the cap, but there is no significant progress to report on those bills. So next we'll have mortgage and home ownership assistance. For most people to buy a home, they need to secure a mortgage loan, which typically requires a down payment, decent credit score, and some cash reserves, as well as proof of a steady income. This can be inaccessible to people who are renting, because they may have difficulty saving money for the down payment and cash reserves while they're still paying rent. Or maybe they rely on multiple part-time jobs or seasonal jobs for their income. A 2021 study estimated that it would take the average renter 14 years to save $15,000 for a down payment. It can be especially difficult for Black people and other people of color to secure mortgages because of differences in credit score and resources stemming from institutional racism and segregation. I included a few stats specific to the disparities between Black and white residents here regarding credit score and just differences in homeownership rates. Traditional mortgages also charge interest and will require private insurance on the mortgage if the payment is less than 20% of the purchase price. So that $15,000 that it took the 14 years for the average renter to save up would only be a 20% down payment on a $75,000 home. So compare this with FHA-backed loans, which are a good method for encouraging homeownership. They allow people to take mortgages out from lenders with insurance from the federal government. So it allows people with lower incomes, lower cash reserves, lower credit scores to secure mortgages they may not have otherwise had access to without the federal backing. These loans can be a great tool for families with low to moderate income. There is no income limit for eligibility, but it can be more expensive in the long run because the FHA loans tend to carry higher interest rates. The next type of homeownership assistance is housing finance agencies. They are state entities that use tax-exempt bonds to finance mortgages for families with low to moderate income. They're really great at adapting to the needs of their communities. Evidence shows that they reduce racial disparities in homeownership. They also support their communities through the homeownership process by requiring participation in homeownership counseling. HFAs have been really successful, especially with the homeownership counseling, because it helps improve financial literacy and helps people prioritize and spend their money wisely to save money then in the long run. And this kind of homeownership counseling offsets the risk of lending to buyers with fewer resources. So it is a great tool for any lender, let alone housing finance agencies, to reduce the risk of lending to a lower resourced person. So HFA borrowers are about 30% less likely to default on their mortgage or experience foreclosure than similarly situated non-HFA borrowers. And this outcome is consistent even taking into consideration changes in economy or over time. As far as health benefits to homeownership, overall research indicates that policies designed to facilitate homeownership may do more to improve health and well-being than renter protections. Homeowners report higher self-esteem and happiness and higher perceived control over their lives than renters. They view their communities as safer, stronger, and more stable, and tend to be more informed and civically engaged than renters. Children that grow up in homes their families own have better grades, higher graduation rates, and better employment and earning opportunities than children that grow up in rentals. However, homeownership is not for everyone and should only be encouraged when appropriate. Specifically, it may not be wise for people with unstable jobs, incomes, who relocate often, or who just are not ready for the commitment and responsibility of owning a home. So moving on to community land trusts. These are systems of shared ownership that make homeownership permanently more affordable and accessible by separating the cost of the land from the cost of the home. So what happens is a nonprofit organization, the trust, will buy properties and sell the residences on the land for a below market price to individuals or families with eligible low incomes. The nonprofit boards are governed by community leaders, community members. The residences they buy may be single family, or they can be units in multifamily buildings. Most often they are single family homes. The homes are also not always concentrated in one place. CLTs will buy underpriced land and will buy it up small individual properties throughout the city as it becomes available, as opposed to buying like 100 acres at a time and developing it. So the trust then leases the land that the home is on to the homeowners for a 99-year lease term. The leases typically cost anywhere from $1 a year to $100 per month. Proceeds from the land lease are used by the trust to help pay property taxes, cover administrative expenses, or they will go into a property repair reserve. The homeowners are free to make changes to the property. They can use it as they wish, although most times the community land trust will retain the power through the lease to force the homeowner to make necessary repairs on the home to prevent it from falling into disrepair. So this table just compares traditional homeownership to homeownership in a community land trust. I already went through some of this. I'll also point out though that when you sell your home that is in a CLT, you are required by the land lease to sell to someone who meets the income eligibility requirements, and you can only sell it to them for a below market price set by a formula the CLT has established. So this formula does allow homeowners to benefit from the equity on their homes. Otherwise, it would just be the same as renting, but it is limited. Whereas with traditional homeownership, you can sell to anyone for any price. But this restriction is what keeps the homes affordable permanently or long-term. Another benefit of the CLT is that the homeowner may be eligible for help, either financial or otherwise, with maintenance and repairs, while traditionally you would be on your own to fund such things. This is a map of where CLTs are located throughout the world. The different colors just signify which countries they're associated with. So the first CLT in the world was established in Ohio in 1969, but they didn't become prevalent until the 90s. So today we have over 160 in the US, still growing here and elsewhere. Some examples of American CLTs, the largest one in the world is in Vermont, which it has over 3,000 homes in its repertoire. A CLT in Houston, Texas, between mid-2019 and mid-2020, housed 47 people and 21 homes. And the median sale price to those people was 3 times lower than the area median in the traditional market. Overall, operating a CLT is financially sustainable, although you do need significant resources up front. The resources necessary to keep it going are fairly minimal. CLTs are also always local, which helps them respond to local needs and protect their communities from gentrification. Residents in CLTs also have very low rates of foreclosure. CLTs also carry less stigma than other affordable housing, like public housing projects, because the people living in them are homeowners and they're spread throughout the community, so they tend to blend in, they're not sectioned off or separated. Last slide on community land trusts. So state and local governments can support CLT development by offering grants or tax incentives. I'm based in Baltimore, so I'll use a local example. The headline here is City Announces Community Land Trust Awards, and the article is from March of last year. The city invested $2.25 million in 3 local CLTs, one of which being Charm City Land Trust. In the background here, I have a Google Street View image of one of the homes currently for sale by the Charm City Land Trust. I believe it's the one closest to the tree on the left side, if you can see my mouse. And for those of you who have never been to Baltimore, these row home styles make up most of what you see in the city. So they're pretty average, typical homes that are being sold by CLTs. All right, last but certainly not least, zoning codes. These dictate what can and cannot be done with land. So for expansions in public housing and building more multifamily housing to benefit public health, local zoning codes need to allow those things to take place in the first place. So they can be a significant barrier to affordable housing. Many times they require minimum lot sizes, setback requirements that dictate how far from the street a home must be built. They'll have maximum density allowances or prohibit multifamily housing units altogether. Single-family homes on larger lot sizes are significantly more expensive than condos in larger buildings or small homes grouped close together, like the ones in the photo of Baltimore I just showed you. Originally, some zoning requirements were meant to protect public health. Limiting density would keep communicable diseases at bay, keep neighborhoods from overwhelming their sewage systems, etc. Other zoning requirements were used as a tool for racial segregation and mistreatment. We know that use of zoning codes for segregation became especially prevalent after the 1968 Fair Housing Act, when outright housing discrimination became illegal. Some policymakers began eagerly adopting zoning regulations that would preserve all white neighborhoods by limiting them to single-family homes unaffordable for minorities. Affordable housing models like multifamily units were then only allowed in areas that included a lot of unhealthy uses, like Maria was just mentioning, like heavy industry, plentiful alcohol and tobacco outlets. So all this to say, there are undoubtedly zoning laws in every city across the country that are no longer necessary for public health, or that were initially grounded in racism, that need to be changed in order for housing to become more affordable, available, and equitable. So local governments have the most significant influence in this area. They have significant autonomy when it comes to their zoning codes, and drivers of affordability tend to vary significantly between communities. So it's good that the power lies with local entities. Local governments can start addressing affordability and availability by looking at their current zoning codes and considering the original purposes of policies that restrict affordable housing and whether those purposes are still valid and necessary. So, for example, if a set of provisions was designed in the early 20th century to control waterborne illnesses and protect sewage treatment facilities from being overwhelmed, we might want to reevaluate them considering today's technology and infrastructure and abilities. Should also consider how their community has changed over the years, maybe a population boom or a change in economy from industrial to technology, and they need to reevaluate their community's needs. The next step, of course, is to adopt more inclusive policies. And to do that, they will have to address opposition to inclusive zoning. Many of you have heard the not in my backyard attitude that can often be driven by implicit bias, racism, or classism, where people support more affordable apartments or public housing, but they don't want them in their neighborhoods. They often cite concerns over decreases in property values. To fight this, inclusive zoning advocates can point to data that shows their concerns are unfounded, and can team up with neighboring communities to get a broader base of support. So 3/4 of the land in American cities is zoned only for single family housing. So that is a pretty significant barrier to filling gaps in availability, let alone to building more affordable multifamily units. So states may need to step in and give their local governments a push. They can preempt specific kinds of exclusionary zoning, require more inclusive zoning, like requiring local governments to allow multifamily housing on a minimum proportion of land. They can offer technical and legal assistance. So for example, Massachusetts has made it easier for developers building affordable housing to get their permits and plans approved, and also offers financial incentives to local governments that increase density allowances near public transit centers. States can also adopt state affordable housing appeal systems, which allow developers in certain areas of the state to appeal a local permit denial to the state if those developers are including affordable housing in their plans. So that is all. I will just quickly end with, since we are talking about climate, and I've been talking a lot about multifamily housing, I'll point out that multifamily housing has shown to increase environmental sustainability through efficient building and operation of the residential units, higher density, that means residents don't have to drive everywhere, and it increases tax bases and leads to more efficient use of public resources like trash removal, public parks, and public transportation. So thank you. Happy to answer questions or here or via email.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks for those great presentations, Melissa, Maria, and Brianne. We had quite a few questions come in during your presentations. And so if we can you're all on video here, and I'm just going to ask these questions, and some of them are very specific to your presentation and others are more generalized. So feel free to hop in on anything you want to weigh in here. The first question here is, in both Oakland and the Bay Area and in Newark, does rent control exist as a method to help mitigate displacement? And if not, has it been discussed as a viable tool? And then as a follow-up, is there political will? Multi-part question.
Yeah, there's a whole range of tenant protections that exist across the Bay Area. And in fact, we did a planning process, I want to say 4 years ago now, called CASA, which was a regional planning process on housing. And we came up with 3 strategies that are core to address housing in the Bay Area. One is tenant protections. And so we have, during COVID-19, we had COVID-19 eviction moratoriums. There are places that have had eviction moratoriums for other reasons because of the high housing costs here in the Bay Area. We were able during the course of the pandemic to use the history of having eviction moratoriums in some places in the region and the huge income hits that families saw in the early days of the pandemic to create the political will to have every one of the 9 county Bay Area, some of which are much more conservative than, say, San Francisco or Alameda County, move forward COVID-19 eviction moratoriums. And so we provided health rationale for those places that needed just a little push because there was already such great organizing happening on that. And then in the places that there's been less funding of organizing over time and less history of passing tenant protections, we did work to help local communities see spikes in food bank usage, spikes in legal aid usage to demonstrate that people really needed assistance in that time. We also have anti-rent gouging legislation, so that you can't double people's rent, say, over the course of 30 or 60 days with no real notice. And we have that has passed across many parts of our region and then was driven into a statewide campaign that passed statewide with some of the strongest anti-rent gouging legislation in the country. But all of that took, years of work to build that political will and momentum.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. And so in Newark, we do have rent control. We actually passed a very strong, reissued our rent control in 2016. Our rent control applies to all buildings that are 30 years or more, that if they're owner occupied 6 units or more, if they're not homeowner occupied, then it's 2 units or more are rent controlled. So that's pretty broad. And the rent control buildings, what I love is, well, not these days, but it's tied to the inflation index, right? So for most of the time that rent control has been in effect, it's been like 0.01, it's been a $10 increase. What we found with rent control is that we need enforcement. We have a wonderful rent control on the books, but a lot of people don't understand that. That's why we fought so heavy for right to counsel, and we say we're the first broke city to do it, because I think it's interesting across the country following housing models of the difference between cities like New York, who had governmental surpluses and can really invest in doing, I kind of say, they're doing great stuff, but sometimes it's too little too late for a lot of the residents that have been displaced already. And so many of New York residents are actually in Newark now, right? And so I think it was important to push our city, even though we don't have the money. And that's because the people that live in Newark are still low income people. We're not a rich city. And it was important to push them to issue rent protections. I do think rent control is a good method. But again, none of the policy tools really work unless implementation is followed through, and enforcement is a big thing. Because if no one, then landlords do whatever they want. The COVID-19 protection, we did have a moratorium in place, but we were worried what happened when it lifted, right? And that's why we fought for the People's Bill that prevented all those cases across the state from going to evictions. So landlords only could take people to, civil court, which many didn't, especially the bigger ones, knowing, the most you can do is a 10% on somebody's income, which is a lot, but a lot of the landlords we saw just dropped the cases, right, and declared it a loss and moved on. So that's where we've been really focusing our energy, is on protections, enforcement, and implementation of our policies.
I will note too that rent control is only allowed in 5 states still. So it's funny that we have California and New Jersey both represented on here, 2 of the 5 states, and then plus DC. So just wanted to add that in.
Thank you. Let's see, another question that came in was, can you explain why there's a cap put on public housing and what was the rationale for that?
Yes, so I actually just came across that recently. There was a movement for welfare reform, but it was grounded in belief that public assistance was detrimental to people's ability to achieve economic independence. So we're all familiar with that kind of theory. So it was kind of part of that movement. And most lawmakers apparently also saw public housing complexes as crime infested and unhealthy. And they kept people trapped in poverty. So I think it was more of like a somewhat well-intentioned, the money can be better used elsewhere, but also kind of uninformed and definitely at least a little bit racist. And it was in the 90s that it was capped. So.
Thanks, Brianne. I just do want to note that Melissa is sharing some resources in the chat for everyone to access. Maria and Brianne, if you also have things that could benefit all the group, feel free to add those into the chat too, and everyone can get access to those. And I'm just going to keep running through these questions because there's so many coming in. Let's see. Someone has asked if you could comment on the quality of rental properties and homes as a factor in benefits and harms. If anyone wants to take that question first.
I can just throw just one quick answer in. There's a significant difference in whether your landlord is keeping up with property maintenance. You might be trapped in an expensive apartment that has cracks in the windows and holes in the walls and stuff. So those are extremely significant on your health, and that includes renting, or you own it and you can't afford to fix it. So yes.
Yeah. And something that stood out to us is like after Ida, so many apartments that were actually illegal dwellings became infiltrated with mold, right? And then what was unfortunate is that the landlords were using that as an excuse to kick out the tenants in order to be able to charge more rent, because then they were calling the city and actually getting the city to come and condemn the apartment. So that's a tactic that slumlords use a lot, is letting the property deteriorate to the point that if they want to, they can just call the city or whatever the governing district is to condemn it. It's no longer useful for habitable use. And then they are able to kick out the apartment. They do a major renovation, which gets them around rent control. And that's used as a way to displace people. Another thing I think about the dwelling quality is just that, like that it's a way to harm people, but that in New Jersey, our laws of claiming habitability, right? Like habitability is something that can help tenants withhold their rent so that they can force the landlord to fix. Unfortunately, in New Jersey, that requires the tenants to have all the money deposited up front into a separate bank account, something that people sometimes aren't able to do. They're sometimes trying to actually fix the situation on their own. So even being able to assert your right requires a great degree of money. That puts the tenants in a bad situation. And then when we're thinking about a deteriorating housing stock with increased rainfall, with it's being rained on in the spring and fall, and during the summer we get that urban heat island effect. In Newark, sometimes we're 15 degrees hotter than the nearest suburb because of all the concrete in our neighborhood. So I'm just saying, a lot of pressure. And like you were talking about broken windows, if you're having your AC, you're running up your electricity costs. So we see that climate change with housing and the public health hazard, it's just really layering on people, and honestly it's crushing them.
Thank you for that. I think this question is probably for you, Maria, because I think you may have cut out a little bit when you were talking about the FEMA response following hurricanes. And there's just a question to expand a little bit on how FEMA is treating rental and owner-owned properties differently, and if there's any policy changes that have occurred or that the community is advocating for that can help with, reduce those inequities with the next disaster.
Absolutely. I think a big thing for FEMA is FEMA calculates damage by property damage, so when we're really in this country, I mean, it's based on a foundation of personal property, like that's the heart of capitalism. And I think that that's really, when we're talking about fighting racism, we do need to fight some of the fundamental assumptions that our system is built on. And so when a system of disaster recovery, it wants people to first off go back to status quo, right? And status quo would be, how has your personal property been damaged? That's why when they fly over Newark, it's hard to see, the property damage as when they were flying over the single and two family homes in other parts of New Jersey. That was easy to spot, but when they're looking at apartment buildings and flooded basements, they don't even know people are there. So in a lot of ways during Ida, we suffered from FEMA not being able to see our community at all. We heard that they were flying on helicopters to try to make those quick assessments. We're also fighting with FEMA to understand that community groups, church groups, right? Like, they're first responders, and that actually FEMA should be investing in in this fabric of society that a lot of community members rely on, because there's been a distrust in government, and especially in a time of such vulnerability, it would be important for programs like FEMA or the state or municipal government to actually have those relationships with their community-based organization, your church group, your community center, because those are actually the places where people go to look for help. Yeah, those are just some examples. I won't keep it long-winded there. We have a lot of experience here because, like I said, we flood every time it rains. So.
Thank you. I guess a little more general question that has come in is whether there are any policies that you can discuss related to reducing gentrification in disaster response, specifically as we see increasing number of climate-induced disasters in our country.
Yeah, I think we need more automated models of equity and emergency response. Right now, like when an emergency response is really kicking off in a government agency, they are moving so fast. They've activated an emergency response center that is not necessarily a center operated out of the agencies that spend the most time with community-based organizations and people. And so I think they then operate through this whole system of basically binders that take them through these checklists of processes to be done. And so I think that we should have equity more in those processes. And so the first step, I think, is to have an equity officer assigned to the emergency response. This is like a small step any agency could do without changing their whole system. And that person be charged with budget authority and with staff authority to direct staff to understand what different communities are needing in this moment. We use this a lot during COVID in the Bay Area. For example, there were high levels of COVID-19 infection, much higher than other places in farm worker communities in the what we would call the wine country. Their job was to go out, understand why that was happening, find the solutions that would help make it possible for people to stay home when they were sick, right? Have access to the cachet that was requiring, make sure that it was clear, make sure there was work done with employers that needed to be done, just like it needs to be done during wildfires, to make sure people's health is protected in bad air. For example, in another jurisdiction, we saw that we had a disproportionate Black death rate that equity officer was able to isolate to specific skilled nursing facilities and address it. And I think so we need people who understand how to do that and are connected enough to communities to understand, well, the guidance we're giving is for everyone to self-isolate. People are not living in housing that allows that. What's the other solution? And to create a housing solution for people who need to do that. And we can do that for not just health emergencies, but for climate emergencies too. The other thing to think about is how the emergency management system gets stood up. And I think COVID-19 is a great opportunity for us to learn a lot of lessons that can apply to climate disasters too. And so we're undergoing a process here in the Bay Area to do a regional assessment of what we call an after action report, right? That's what emergency management would call it, with a lens on regional response and on equity. I think those are really good strategies that people and jurisdictions should pursue across the country in partnership with community. And we're going to be sharing our model to do that shortly. So I think the third thing is the state of California has a proposal. There's a proposal moving forward out of public health advocates and COVID-19 justice that is really focused on this idea that when emergency funds come in, there should be a screen around equity that's applied first. And that should be a requirement of how relief funds go out and how recovery dollars go out. And I think that's something to watch and see where that goes.
I'll add, I guess this would be more in the rebuilding phase to avoid gentrification. Like if you're building all brand new buildings, they're going to be expensive. But there are some ways like states can require local like cities to have affordable housing plans, like I mentioned. And so you can require the developers to have a portion of those units go to low or moderate income individuals. So that's just kind of what came to the top of my head. And the state affordable housing appeal systems that I mentioned are a great way to do that too. Developers who want to include low income housing in their developments can basically guarantee that their plans will be approved as long as they meet all the health and safety requirements.
All right, thank you for that. We do have a couple questions here right in a row about community land trusts, so I'll just go ahead and ask them simultaneously. Regarding community land trusts, how do the nonprofits typically afford to buy the land? And then the next question is related to the home ownership. Are these traditional FHA mortgages? Are they traditional or FHA mortgages, or is there a different funding mechanism for home ownership?
So I forget your first question already, but I'll go to the second one. So when you buy a home on a community land trust, you can get funding for that however you are eligible to. So there's no specific one through the CLT unless individual CLTs offer some kind of down payment assistance, but you can do FHA, you can do traditional, get down payment assistance from a state agency, anything. And then the first one was, how they fund purchases of the properties. Yeah. A lot of them I've seen will get an initial grant from the city or the state that they're located in. Like the Baltimore one I just discussed, Baltimore City gave them 3 different places, a total of 2.25 million. So that's kind of to buy more properties and to upkeep the ones they have already. And then they are run like traditional nonprofits. So they have a board with lots of community members and business leaders in the area. So they also work off of private donations and contributions.
If I could, Ironbound has actually helped with community land trust in our neighborhood as one of our preservation strategies. And what we were doing is actually using neighborhood revitalization tax credits. We applied for that as, we have a big community plan. We're really big into community planning, and folks wanted to see more land trusts. We have a county land trust, but it was only working on historic preservation. And so we pitched them the idea that they should expand into housing. And so we were able to use the neighborhood revitalization tax credit program in order to subsidize low income renters, right? Give them $50,000 that they can apply to their down payment, which would hopefully obviously bring down the mortgage to a point that it would become more affordable. And then they would become part of the CLT and get a seat on the board of the CLT so that they can participate in the governance. But that, they could make some equity and still benefit the community by having long-term housing affordability on the block. So that's how we paid for it. And I think that's for it because we're giving that direct subsidy to our community members.
All right, thank you for that. That was really great answers to that question. The next question is around public housing again. My understanding is that in public housing, when residents pay rent on time, it does not improve their credit score. Is there any work happening to change that?
I was just looking up an answer to that question. I'm not sure about the credit score. I was kind of looking into the air conditioning. I don't believe it's required in public housing, but some cities and states will require it to be offered by landlords, but I don't think that it is in public housing right now. And, you know, if it becomes a problem, depending on the city or the state, it could also be kind of the habitability thing that Maria was talking about. Like you can't possibly live there, or if you have some disability. But I want to say sadly, no, that I know of.
In New Jersey, there is a move to get that to count towards your credit score. I mean, it's just really discriminatory, right? If you pay your mortgage, that you're building your credit. But if you pay rent on time, you could live somewhere for 30 years. Many community members in our place do. And so why shouldn't that count towards your credit score? It's the same kind of thinking that like our credit score in New Jersey counts for, it'll give you a lower car insurance payment, right? So it's just another form of classism that I think holds back a lot of our communities. It's just things that are invisible that we need to make visible and really question the foundation that these things are based on.
All right, thank you. Let's see. Next question is curiosity about actions considered to stem property increases that lead to gentrification. Are appraisal processes ever considered? Because there's an understanding that there is bias built into that process.
Yeah, there's a lot of bias built into that process. And I think a lot of us knew that for a long time. So I think a lot of us who have lived in cities that were gentrifying have seen ourselves or our neighbors look to refinance, and then to not get the value they needed in order to refinance, and then to see a purchaser come in and be able to get the value appraised for the property in order to do a purchase. And what's been great, I think, about the last, I don't know, handful of years, 3 or 4 years, is that the data is now really clear to document that thing that we've seen anecdotally for a long time. Here in the Bay Area and in other places across the country, there have been stand-ins in the way we see actually for apartment rentals, right? Where you have a tester come in, you have 2 people with basically the same background looking for an apartment in terms of financially or credit score wise, except they're different races, for example, or another kind of protected class, and you see the discrimination that happens during that. We've now got where we've had people take down, a person of color take down all of our pictures in the house, have a white person stand in the home, and see very different prices appraised for properties. I mean like $60,000 difference, $100,000 difference, really extreme. And so I think there's some work being done now to have more fairness in appraisals. But the truth is the whole appraisal system is built on this sort of comp system that builds in this bias by neighborhood and by race. And so there's some real work to be done to think about what a more fair system is, I think.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Thank you. The next question is around some emerging research on the topic of climate change and increases in mental health related issues, PTSD, as well as worsening transportation structures that make commuting even more stressful. And there, just if anyone could comment on that, it was an important consideration that the commenter wanted to discuss and see if there's anything anyone can expand on that.
I know there's a lot of work being done on like complete streets. So where you have enough room for pedestrians to walk and they're separated enough from the cars where they're safe or they feel safe. And you have, maybe a bus lane and a protected bike lane. So that's kind of the most up-to-date thing I can think of, trying to make commuting a little bit easier and accessible. If you can't afford a car, there's maybe more public transportation. It has a bus lane, you won't be stuck in traffic. You can use a bike and those bike rental stations and stuff. So that's just what comes to my mind is complete streets and how those are kind of becoming more of a consideration.
I can't tell, Melissa, were you trying to answer that question or not?
I am. I'm having a little bit of a mic problem. I was just going to say that there are a lot of interlocking mental health needs that we're seeing and personal support needs, and they're from a whole range of things. And I think that to me feels like a big and important issue, is that there's a layering happening. There's the layering of housing costs. There's the layering of family stress. There's the layering of schools being in and out. There's just all of these things happening right now. And so I think one of the things that's interesting is to figure out where the resources are right now for community-based mental health, and to be expanding those opportunities in each of the communities where we are. I know here in California, there's a new law and reimbursement strategy in place that's allowing the hiring of peer mental health staff. And I think that's huge, because that's both a job opportunity that can be positioned to be a well-paid job opportunity, managed well by jurisdictions. And it's an opportunity for people to be getting mental health services that they feel really comfortable with. So I think that's one thing we can be thinking about. And I guess the thing that I think will be really helpful in that is if we can just open up and democratize mental health services in a way that doesn't have it be sort of segmented out by what the kind of stress is, right? Where you can maybe get access for something for yourself and your child at school, or maybe get access for yourself through a medical provider, but be able to have access that's broad and can deal with the whole of people's lives, I think is going to be really important.
Let's see. So here's a question about some laws in Washington state. So apparently Washington state has a law prohibiting any version of rent control. And that includes limiting rental increases. But at the same time, they're seeing families receiving 20% average rental increases, sometimes maybe even 50 to 100% increases. There is a 60-day requirement notice for eviction, I believe, is the statement here. That has been extended, but how can we work to change this state law that stops cities from doing more?
It would be interesting to look at this state law specifically, because if it prohibits rent control, rent stabilization could still be an option, which is similar, but it limits rental increases more significantly, and it limits them both between leases for the same tenant and between tenants to kind of a lower, more reasonable percentage. So looking at the law and seeing if it doesn't include stabilization, then maybe cities can do stabilization instead of rent control, like strictly. That's what comes to mind for me.
Thanks, Brianne. This is a question. There is Miami-Dade Tenant BOR includes an Office of the Tenant Advocate to help with implementation and enforcement capacity. Any suggestions for best practices to advocate for in that stage?
I'll speak a little bit from the right to counsel experience. Like when that office was first started, it only had one lawyer, so obviously that wasn't going to work out to have one lawyer given the overwhelming need in Newark. So I think it's important to make sure I see a lot of these offices across the country, but they only have one or two staff people. So making sure that the office is appropriately resourced. And then I think it's important that they have the right relationships with other offices. I think is, if there is a rent, I don't know how Miami exactly works, but if there's a code enforcement office, there's probably not rent control based on what you said, Brianne, or earlier, but code enforcement, I think, is another key piece of the puzzle here that we use a lot, is making sure that these code enforcement officers come in so that if there is a tenant advocate, like we keep repeating over and over, deteriorating housing conditions, I think it would be important to make sure that they have a good relationship with the rent control, with the code enforcement office, and that both those offices are appropriately resourced. And I think even to the last question, above all, I think it's really important to get tenants involved so that they're fighting for their own rights and they're to the city council people, the state legislators, like we can't do these advocating for policies with just policy think tanks, or because let's just be honest, a lot of people that work in nonprofits own their own homes, right? Like it might be nonprofit work is humble, but if you own a home, you're not in that precarious rental situation. And so having table whenever you're designing policy is both important, and it helps with legislators see the importance when they hear directly from the people who are being affected.
Yeah, I really want to agree with that, Maria. So one of the things we saw, the difference between policy advocates and tenants talking about and advocating for this work is that, there's a great difference between the policy intent and what actually happens. And so the link to enforcement is so clear when tenants are talking about the difference between rights that are coming online and what the actions of their landlords are. And so I think, like you mentioned earlier, this idea of having right to counsel, because we see that the exceptional vast majority of landlords who end up taking a tenant into a legal proceeding do that through an attorney. And the percentage of tenants who have attorneys to respond to that is so much lower. And so having an opportunity for not only for access to legal counsel has been really important to protecting the rights that have gotten put into place across the region.
Thank you. So let's see this next question. Are there any proposed policies related to environmental requirements for new housing or / remodels? Thinking about how low-income and Black and Brown populations are disproportionately affected by climate change.
I wasn't sure if you wanted to jump in, Melissa. You looked eager on that one, but I will say I care obviously about people being able to remain safe during climate change. One thing I am distressed about is the flood requirements and how much more expensive that is getting, especially specifically for Black and Brown neighborhoods, right? Because when we're thinking about adding flood insurance, that's sometimes a $30,000 a year cost. And that's, I think, a policy that's kind of intersecting with the housing crisis and creating a deeper racial inequality in the housing system. So that's something that it's a little controversial because we want homes to be protected. And, so a lot of what we're seeing is an abuse from landlords or developers to use these new environmental protections, right, to like have the hiring of buildings as an excuse to why they can't build affordable housing, or like if they're going to build affordable housing, it's on the high end of the AMI. It's the 100% of the AMI or the 80%, as opposed to what we want to see, which is that deep affordability going to 30% of the AMI or 50. Yeah, so I think are not good examples, but I think it's something that we all need to be vigilant about because we don't want to ever put the environment against people. Like we need to protect people and protect the environment together, and make sure that we all make it onto the other side.
All right. It's a question. One of the attendees in their work sees home ownership is listed as more valued among older populations, whereas younger generations are often expressing they're less interested in home ownership, the yoke of home ownership. Is this a theme seen somewhere else, or how are these generational differences sort of playing out?
I mean, I've seen it as a trend overall. I think partially because of the price of buying right now is just unreachable for younger people. So they just don't want to think about it, or kind of lower salaries. And this might be biased because I work in public interest and, my friends are all kind of in public service. So they're kind of in the area of like, let's just keep renting. There's also the frequent moving and kind of uncertainty around where you want to live. There was that movement out from cities to rural during COVID and beyond. So it's definitely a trend everywhere. I don't know if Maria and Melissa have more specific to their communities, but.
Yeah, I know over the last decade and change, realtors were looking at that a lot. And I think my sense is that there's a bifurcation that's different across different communities. So one thing that I think is true is that people are delaying having children. And we do see a whole wave of people want to own their first home as they're having a child. And so they move into a slightly older demographic for that. So I think that is true. I will say for African-American communities across the country, homeownership is still a strong value. And we see a massive disproportionality of white homeownership versus African-American homeownership in every demographic group. And you hear a lot about people wanting to own homes. And so I don't think, my sense is we aren't similar to that, we're not even close to satisfying the affordable housing need. I don't think we're in any level of risk of over satisfying people's want to purchase a home. And so I think the question is, what are the ways that we are increasing choice for people, especially for BIPOC communities that have been locked out of a lot of prosperity? And so I think that can be land trusts and land trust models and collective ownership models. It can be traditional home ownership. It can be a range. And I think sometimes in the nonprofit community, we start to think about what is the one we think people should have. And I think the more racial equity forward strategy would be, what are the range of things that people are envisioning for their lives next?
Yeah, I think that an interesting question, because I feel like there's like too much unsaid in the question itself, right? Like, oh, people are just disinterested. But like I guess it's important to remember, like, young people are faced with so much student loans that older people did not have, right? I don't think this is a generational thing about what are your choices. You know, I think Melissa said it really well. There's in a lot of values in our communities about having our homes be ours, right? And there's also a lot of trauma with not being able to purchase home and having historic barriers against being able to purchase homes, particularly in our communities, you know, our histories of redlining in this country. So I think if we're not confronting all of that, then we can't make this into like people are not interested in buying homes when there's so many inequalities that have been structurally woven into the system. So I think that that's just incredibly, and you know, you can't judge people about what they have, what they don't have, if they just can't even afford it. I don't know who has those big down payments. When I look at, you know, I'm like, what do I qualify in FHA? Let me be real, right? If you're trying to dig yourself out of poverty, it's not just you, it's you and your family. And generational poverty makes it really hard to purchase a home, especially with these, you know, the skyrocketing market right now. It's become ridiculous, I think, for people to be able to just find their way in.
And we're just getting out of that that time that would sit on your credit report if you were part of the wave of foreclosures that happened after the mortgage the sort of mortgage crisis of 2008, when there was all that taking advantage of people all over the country.
And what Maria was saying reminded me of, didn't you say what 73% of the people in your neighborhood rent? So like, who are they going to be able to buy the places that they're renting? You know, so many places are being bought up by commercial landlords or just large landlords that own, you know, 30 home rental properties. And so you just can't outbid them. You know, they're going to make more money off of it. And so they're going to offer more money when they're buying the home. So they're just not available too. I wish I had the stats. I had them when I was making the PowerPoint. I didn't use all of them, but there are some stats for the availability and how low it is for everyone, particularly for BIPOC and, you know, low income. There's an extreme shortage. So.
Well, it looks like we're not going to get to the last couple of questions, and I apologize for that. This was such an amazing discussion, and I really appreciate all of you taking the time to have this really in-depth discussion and share your knowledge with us. I also want to say thanks to my colleague April Shaw for planning this particular webinar. She invited such a wonderful panel, and the discussion was so wonderful. So I just wanted to acknowledge her planning efforts in that as well. And we do have some contact information that you could contact someone at the network like myself, and I can certainly pass along questions as needed. But I'm so sad we can't get to these last couple of questions, but I really want to say thank you again for this wonderful insight.